Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala has made history as the first woman and the first African to lead the World Trade Organization. It follows an impressive career at the World Bank. As Director General of the WTO, she plans not just to overhaul the ailing organisation, but also to help end the COVID pandemic.
It's not about helping Africa or helping low-income countries it's about our common good, because these variants will come back.
In 2020, she was named as Forbes African of the Year and regularly ranks in lists of the world's greatest and most influential leaders.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining this subscriber-only event. I'm Zanny Minton Beddoes, The Economist's editor-in-chief, and I am delighted to welcome Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Dr. Ngozi, thank you so much for joining me.
Well, thank you, Zanny. It's great to see you.
Dr. Ngozi, you had a very distinguished and, may I say, rather varied career. So I guess my first question is, why did you go for the World Trade Organization? You describe yourself as a trade outsider. Why did you want to lead the WTO?
You know, I've always wanted to serve. My whole life has been public service. And the WTO is a very important organization. The multilateral trading system has been instrumental in helping to lift hundreds of millions out of poverty. And we have a problem of inclusion in the world today. Many developing countries are yet to benefit to the extent they should, and there's still benefits for developed countries to be had. So putting all this together, trying to reform the WTO and bring it to a position where it can truly serve people, as was written out in the Marrakesh Charter, setting up this organization. That's what attracted me. Using it as an instrument to help people create jobs, enhance living standards, and support sustainable development.
Well, that is, of course, all music to our ears at The Economist. As you know, we were founded in 1843 to fight for the cause of free trade, and we have been staunch supporters of the multilateral trading system. But you, I think, early on called yours an impossible job. Why is your job impossible, and why is the WTO in such dire straits right now?
Well, I think, Zanny, for a couple of reasons. One is that the WTO has not updated its rules to 21st century standards for some time. For example, in the area of digital and e-commerce, we still don't have the rules that underpin trade there. The WTO has been taking a long time to negotiate any agreements, and it hasn't had a multilateral agreement negotiated for years. Like the fisheries subsidies, it's been going on for 20 years, agriculture, 20 years. These are all very important areas for the world, for global commons issues. And these things have been going on. So people have started looking to see, is there going to be a success out of the WTO? And part of the reason is the consensus nature of decision making at the WTO. So any one member has an equal right as any other, which is fantastic for small countries, where they're usually, if it's shareholding, they're usually outweighed or outnumbered. But this time, the consensus building means that any one member can stop an agreement from going forward. So I think that mode of decision making is both good in the sense that it allows everyone to have a voice, but it's also not as conducive to reaching agreements as one would like. So these are some of the reasons that there haven't been successes. Now, the point is that the WTO has the opportunity now to really make itself felt as relevant. And I'm happy to say that this is happening. The WTO has been at the center of the issue of how do we solve the COVID-19 pandemic. Trade and health issues are paramount now. And Zanny, that the multilateral trading system has been quite resilient throughout this pandemic. And whereas trade shrank by 7% in value last year, trade in medical supplies and equipment actually increased by 16%, and personal protective equipment 50%. So the trade, multilateral trade, underpinned by WTO rules, has been very instrumental in moving goods around in this pandemic. And The WTO we're also working actively with manufacturers of vaccines. We had a conference here 2 months ago to try to work with them on how can we help them monitor supply chains, which is something we can do. Our members are the ones who put on export restrictions, trade restrictive measures, or trade facilitating measures. So working with them to make sure that their supply chains flow freely, and helping them monitor supplies of raw materials. These are things we're trying to do to encourage them to put in additional capacity to increase the supply of vaccines in emerging markets and developing countries. Thirdly, the issue of intellectual property and know-how and transfer of technology is also one that is very live at the WTO. So we're at the center of the debate of how do we increase access to vaccines. So this is very relevant.
You've raised a huge amount there, and I hope we cover a lot of that during this conversation. I think you're right when you say that the way that the World Trade Organization operates, its consensus building requirements, sometimes leads people to think that it's impotent, and the areas that it's not got agreements on leads others to think that it is irrelevant. But let's just park that, and we'll get back to that and start with the pandemic, because you're absolutely right. The pandemic has been a huge area where the WTO can and should play a role. But I think when COVID-19 first struck, some 80 countries implemented export bans on medicines and PPE. And just yesterday, you published in your trade monitoring report, you warned that though those trade restrictions are coming down, too many obstacles still exist to hamper the free flow of medical inputs and critical supplies. Isn't that worrying that if you have, during a crisis, basically countries ignoring the WTO's rules, that it really isn't centrally relevant?
No, absolutely not, Zanny, because there's no other place in the world where you can bring the world together and say, look, we need to act in concert because we have an issue of the global commons, a pandemic, and we need to make sure that we help to solve it. There's no other place but the WTO. And I have to say, members implemented more trade facilitating measures, trying to do away with tariffs and customs duties and bureaucracy so goods could move around more easily, even food, which is not something you discount in a crisis, that we had food for net food importing nations. Nevertheless, as they say, like Oliver Twist, you always want more. So I always want more. We started the pandemic with 109 restrictive measures. We are down to 53. But for me, 53 is still too many, and we need to try and get those down. And our members need to open up so that these raw materials are not restricted in any way, and that also outputs can move. So we're as relevant as ever.
And what are then the concrete things that you can do to help deal with the pandemic? What is your role to quietly, nudge people behind the scenes? Is it to shout from the rooftops? What do you see as your role?
I see both. Nudge behind the scenes and shout from the rooftops. We shout from the rooftops about the number of restrictive measures. We also praise where our members have been doing the right thing. For example, I have to say that the EU, China, India have been exporting vaccines to other countries, and that deserves a lot of praise. Some of them put back measures like EU and India when there were spikes in their own parts of the world, in their own countries, because of the politics. But they did export. We have to praise that. And, you nudge from behind those who are trying to do the right thing, so they do more of it. So it's a bit of both that we have to do, and that gets results.
So the question of vaccines and getting broad-based access to vaccines is probably the single most pressing issue of the moment. I mean, we are increasingly seeing that uneven vaccination rates is dividing the world into, the jabs and the jab-nots. And that, my colleagues wrote about that just recently. It's a really, really searing divide now in the world. And you've called equitable access to vaccines, I think, the, quote, moral and economic issue of our time. So what do you think is the greatest practical barrier that is preventing that equitable access?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. Let me start with one. The key issue is the supply scarcity in the world. and that has to be solved. And to solve that, you need to increase supply. So how do we do that? I think you have to bring in more manufacturing capacity. The world just did not invest in enough manufacturing capacity. Remember, Zanny, that we normally produce about maximum 5 billion doses of vaccines a year. Now we need 10, we need even more if we go for boosters. So putting in that capacity or mobilizing idle capacity where there is some is very important. For example, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, in parts of Latin America, in parts of Africa, there's the ability to mobilize some manufacturing capacity and build in more. That is the quickest way to try to boost supplies. But to get jabs into arms, of course, because that boosting manufacturing capacity will take some months. If we have donations from the developed countries who have now vaccinated high numbers, high percentages of their populations, and we can distribute those fairly quickly through COVAX and other mechanisms, that will really help. Then if you continue with this business of trying to improve manufacturing capacity, transfer know-how and technology, and resolve the issue of what we do about IP. This will also help to bring more vaccine into production and eventually distribution. Because the situation in which we have, let's say, take Africa, my continent, for example, 3.6 doses per 100 people compared to 78 doses per 100 people in developed countries. It's just not tenable. It's not about helping Africa or helping low-income countries it's about our common good, because these variants will come back, if people are not vaccinated, and they'll come and hunt those who have already been vaccinated, as we're seeing already.
Really important, and we'll get into how to boost supply in those countries in a second. But firstly, just in terms of the supply of existing vaccines, you wrote before the recent G7 summit, you called on leaders for a stepped up, coordinated strategy. Were you satisfied with the billion doses that they promised? I mean, I think the WHO has said we need 13 billion. So was this much too small, or were you satisfied with the rich world's response?
Yeah, Zanny, well, I think you're referring to the opinion piece that the four of us, from the heads of the IMF, the WTO, the WHO, and the World Bank did, talking about $50 billion to help vaccinate 40% of people in developing countries this year, 60% next year. And that would really generate $9 trillion in GDP, with an extra trillion in taxes in developed countries. So we think that this is a very good way to go. Now, the billion doses from the G7 is very welcome. Every bit helps. But of course, we don't think it's enough. And we hope that we're going to see more action from members of the G7. They've come forward also to talk about investing in manufacturing capacity in developing countries. The EU has set aside €1 billion for that. So that's very welcome. So both donate more doses, because what we have now is not enough. More importantly, Zanny, even the donated ones are not being distributed yet. So the issue is not receiving donations 3 months from now, 6 months from now. It's now. It's now that we need to get the jabs in people's arms before those variants spread. So time is of the essence.
Absolutely. I just wanted to turn now to a question from Ajith, one of our subscribers, who asks, do you think we're heading to a situation where certain wealthy regions of the world will open up for international travel between themselves, whilst the vast majority of regions of the poorer world will be isolated on account of those differences in vaccination rates?
Well, this is our very fear as well. This inequity could spread from inequity in access to vaccines to inequity in travel to inequity in participation in various global fora. And that is why we are also insisting that this should not happen. There's a danger it could. I mean, countries are requiring vaccine certificates, and this does not bode well for those who have not been vaccinated.
And now let's turn to the question of intellectual property. And another subscriber, Damien, has raised this too, which is, What are your views on waiving the TRIPS agreement, which, for those of you who are not complete trade wonks, is the agreement within the WTO's rules which covers intellectual property, including for drugs? Do you think intellectual property rules should be waived?
Zanny, I'm afraid I'm going to have to disappoint you and the listeners because look at it from my side. I have members, some of who believe in waiving intellectual property, that this is what is critical to having increased access to vaccines. I have others who question it. So my role is to bring them together, not to take sides with one or the other. So that's what I'm trying to do. Some good news is that finally members are beginning to engage in text-based negotiations. This is the only way we'll move forward, by them actually looking at what agreements are on the table and negotiating those. And for a long time, it was, members trading questions back and forth. Now they're actually looking at text. So I'm hopeful that some pragmatic solution which allows developing countries almost automatic access to being able to manufacture vaccines, whilst at the same time incentivizing research and development can be found. I know the solution is there, but it's up to members to come to it, and I hope they will. I'm in a hurry. I would love to see them do something by July, because we are talking about lives.
By July? July starts in a couple of days' time, so that would be very impressive. But I guess I understand why you are bringing together groups of countries with very different views. So I understand why you don't want to lay your cards on the table. But just one question: do you think that what this argument is about is how to deal with, let's say, the next 6 or 9 months, how to deal with this pandemic, or is it really about rethinking the rules for the next one?
I think if you ask the proponents of the IP waiver, they'll say it's both. They say it's pertinent to increasing access now, but also hopefully for the future. But I would say that, look, let's remember that there are other things that are needed in order to boost the dose of vaccines and to boost the quantity, sorry. And the proponents of the waiver also accept this. They accept that IP is not the only critical factor, that we actually need transfer of technology with that and know-how. Having been in the vaccine business myself for about 5 years as chair of the board of Gavi, I know that even if they give you IP, if there's no transfer of technology with it and you don't work with the manufacturers, you won't be able to go far in manufacturing any vaccine. So that is also very important. Critically important is what I spoke about before. You just need manufacturing capacity. It doesn't exist. There's not enough now in the world. So even if you get IP and know-how and you don't have the places to which to manufacture the vaccine, you're still nowhere. Secondly, supply chains. If you have the other two, but your supply chains can't move, you also cannot manufacture. Remember, Zanny, that the supply chains for some of these vaccines are really complex. Let me just quote, Johnson & Johnson needs 180 components manufactured at 67 sites in 12 countries to make its vaccines. So supply chain issues are really key. Today at the WTO, we're having a supply chain monitoring symposium. And all of this is to try and help industry to see how we can help them move forward. So all these aspects are needed.
So all of that suggests, and I completely agree with you, that there are so many elements beyond this narrow question of intellectual property. Is it fair to say that the question of intellectual property is actually a sort of ideological one as much as a practical one? That for both sides, for proponents of getting rid of having a waiver, it is to push equity, and for people who believe in the importance of intellectual property to spur pharmaceutical companies to innovation, it is about the principle. But that actually there are many other things that are important for getting distribution and production in the shorter term at least.
Yes, Zanny, I think there's some truth in what you say. From the proponents, they look at what happened during the HIV/AIDS epidemic years ago, where it took 10 years before, and people were dying before people had access to HIV generic drugs that they could afford. They look at what happened with H1N1 a few years ago, where the rich countries bought up all the vaccines and poor countries had none. So it's a question in a way of principle of look, when there's an emergency of global health proportions, there should be access. All people should have access so that nobody should die when we have the technology to save them. You look at the other side, and those who question say, look, there have been years spent and a great deal of resources, trying to fund innovation and research and development. If we don't do that, then the next pandemic, nobody may have an answer to it, and we may all die. And for that reason, if you waive the rights, then nobody will be incentivized into research and development. And so that's the way they see it. And, on both sides, you have to look at both arguments which have truth in them. And that is why I think that if members sit down and see each other's point of view, they can actually come up with an answer with a solution that takes account of both problems. But there are questions of principles, of lives, of philosophy behind it.
Well, I think with you managing and steering that discussion, they have as good a chance as any. Let's move to another equally big challenge, which is how the WTO navigates a world where the aspirant superpower of China and the current superpower of the US have an increasingly antagonistic relationship. I mean, that rivalry is setting the stage for the next few decades of the 21st century. And it seems to me that the world is heading into economic blocs, both oriented around those rival powers. How does that fit with the multilateral philosophy of the WTO? If China and the US are locked in a trade war, what can the WTO do to temper the hostility?
Well, that's precisely why the WTO was created, to avoid the trade wars we used to see in centuries past. And it's largely been able to do that because at least countries know that when they have a problem, there's a place they can bring a dispute. And you've seen, even with some paralysis of the dispute settlement system, countries have been bringing those disputes. So the WTO is very relevant. We need to reform and revive our appellate body and our dispute settlement system to make it fully functional. But still, it's there. And now you have these tensions. Let me say something, Zanny, that sometimes a lot of political issues that don't really have to do with trade are being settled with trade as a weapon and an instrument. And we would hope that we could avoid that, that we'll try to restrict trade issues to trade issues and not get them involved with other political issues. That being said, one very tricky trade issue that is bedeviling the situation right now is a feeling on the parts of some members, the US, the EU, and others, that the level playing field is no longer level. The level playing field that is guaranteed by WTO rules for the multilateral trading system is no longer working because there are worries about the subsidies of state-owned enterprises, industrial subsidies in China, that this is distortionary and not good for competition. On the other hand, China also worries and talks about what we call domestic support, agricultural subsidies, that they also say are distortionary and also marring competition. There are other members on both sides who say this. So these are level playing field issues that the WTO can and should attempt to solve to help members come around to find solutions. How do we do it? What we've done now is we've joined with the IMF, the World Bank, and OECD to launch a study on level playing field issues, on all these subsidies, both industrial and agricultural, across the board, to put facts on the table. In conjunction with that, we've just launched at the WTO our own study on industrial subsidies. It's very important to have facts on the table for members to see what are the negative spillovers of these subsidy policies. And then once we have those, we can look at our rules. Are they fit for purpose for today's environment? And the answer is probably we'll need to update the rules in some fashion to be able to cope with these level playing field issues. That is how we can help China and the US. That's how we can help the EU, the UK, and all others who have these concerns.
I think at a sort of technocratic level, that all sounds incredibly sensible. But I guess my concern is that the sense of zero sum between these two countries now, and the sense of danger, each sees the other as a dangerous strategic rival, that isn't really conducive to working together. I mean, the growing view in the United States is, I think, to the need to prevent China's dominance, and a sense that integration, the approach of bringing China into the multilateral system, has really failed. And I think in China, the opposite view is the case. The view there is that America is trying to stop China's natural rise. When you have such a such a distanced view between, such a diametrically opposed view between the two sides, with really such a zero-sum approach, can technocratic approaches of the sort you're laying out really have a hope of working?
I think they can help. Look, I mean, the United States and China both recognize that there are areas where they have to cooperate. That's why you have the multilateral system. They recognize that there's strategic competition and strategic cooperation around issues like the pandemic. The world has had to come together to share knowledge and vaccines and know-how and so on, but also around climate change. When one part of the world realizes that you can't solve the problem unless the other is participating, then they have to have strategic cooperation. So it's not every single thing that is this zero-sum game. And I think both China and the US realize they need each other, and the world needs them to be able to solve these problems. So that already gives one area. And I'll tell you, right now as we speak, Zanny, the US, the EU, China, everybody's around the table here at the WTO negotiating a multilateral agreement, which is called the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement. It's to support the sustainability of our oceans. 1/3 of our fish stocks are no longer sustainable, up from 10% in 1970. So this is a big issue. And we're all negotiating trying to do away with harmful fisheries subsidies, about 35 billion in total. We are all around the table, all these members. Now, if you can get a win in such a negotiations, and mark you, they've been going on for 20 years. So I'm not trying to be Pollyannish. It will still take a lot of work to close it. But imagine we close that. That's one area of the global commons that all these countries have come together and said, yes, we need to work together. So I don't think everything has to be or needs to be a zero-sum game. And the WTO is well situated for those areas that are not so antagonistic, that need everybody around the table. We're well situated to help.
And when you discuss with the US and indeed with China, is your sense that both parties believe in the WTO as an institution? Because the previous US administration really didn't. I mean, there were kind of constant threats to leave the World Trade Organization. I think the Trump team really didn't think it was particularly effective or useful, and had probably hurt America. Is the Biden administration more clearly committed to the WTO? And is the same true also of Xi Jinping and the Chinese government?
Well, let me say this, that the WTO, I mean, on both sides of the aisle, both for Republicans and Democrats, there have been issues and problems with the WTO for some time. So it's not purely a Trump era issue. Through the various administrations of Obama, even before Trump, there were issues to do with the dispute settlement system and the complaints of the US that it didn't work well, especially the appellate body. And that is why they blocked the nomination of judges till now. And they do make some very valid points that we need to look at and say, what are the issues they are putting on the table, and how do we listen to that, and solve those issues. So I think, Zanny, I think there's some merit to some of the issues being put on the table. But it is very, very true that it's easier to have dialogue now. And I want to tell you one thing. The United States has never stopped paying its dues at the WTO. So even through the Trump time, the budget, the allocation was paid faithfully. So I think that really speaks to the fact that they know the WTO is very, very important. There is no head of state I know of now, or prime minister or president in the world, who doesn't think the WTO is important and wants it reformed. And I've spoken to quite a few of them. They are all encouraging. They all want to see this organization work well. Ditto for China. China, the same. China also has issues. Every member has issues. Developing countries have their issues with the WTO, but all realize that if the WTO did not exist, you would have to invent it, because this is the only place you can solve certain problems related to trade.
Well, that brings us to a question from Gabe, one of our listeners, who asks you, what can the WTO do when a country like China does not play by the rules?
Well, I think one of the things we are trying to do for China or any other member that it seems they're not playing by the rules is to try to get evidence, very concrete facts on the table about what, through our monitoring work. We do a lot of monitoring work. It's not always perfect because sometimes members don't disclose, they're not as transparent in putting facts there, but we do have a lot of information. And what I'm saying is that with respect to these issues, which we call level playing field issues, let us get concrete facts on the table about where it's hurting, where the negative spillovers are, not just on developed countries, by the way, but the emerging markets that are also complaining of the lack of competition in certain areas. With that, we can then see our rules fit for purpose. We do have rules against these kinds of subsidies, but are they up to scratch in dealing with the new sophisticated way of having subsidies? We are even worrying a little bit about the very wonderful stimulus that has led to a fast economic recovery, but there's been a lot of it. And we have to look to make sure that some of it does not become distortionary and is kept for the longer term. So all of these things, the approach is put facts on the table, match them up with the rules, and if our rules are not up to date, we change them, we update them. That is part of the reform.
Let me follow up on your comment on the stimulus, and particularly the US stimulus, because quite a lot of President Biden's stimulus is designed to be spent on goods and services produced in America. Buy American is an enormous part of Bidenism, if you will. Do you think that Buy America will end up being against WTO rules?
Well, we'll have to see, Zanny. We have to monitor it. I'm sure that the Biden administration does not want to knowingly go against WTO rules, so knowingly or unknowingly. So we'll monitor it, we'll see what it is, we'll match it up to our rules, and we'll discuss with them when the time comes. I mean, for instance, we've talked about the DPA, the Defense Production Act, and what that means for supply chains. These are not easy conversations to have, but we've had them with the US Trade Representative, and they've opened up and allowed some of these supplies to move to India and other places. So what you can do at each turn is look at the rules, show where they are not complying, and have a dialogue. But I'm hoping that all these will be done in a way that does not go against WTO rules.
But just pushing that a bit more deeply, it seems to me that it's not just the US. Every country is looking towards, critical supply chains at home, boosting domestic production. It's very much the fashion now. Industrial policy is back in fashion. Isn't this a sort of intellectual shift across many countries that really is at odds with the philosophy that underpins the World Trade Organization, which is of similar rules for everybody? I mean, do you find that you are now talking to leaders in an environment where they are just in a different frame of mind from where they might have been 10, 15 years ago?
I agree completely. That's the truth. There has been a shift towards protectionism. There is a populism, and this is partly due to what technology, along with globalization, has delivered. Whilst it's lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, it's also left some people behind. And, for instance, in certain areas of the US and other parts of the world, if you don't have active labor market policies, then you're not going to correct those market failures. And that leads to a lot of people who feel left behind. And that leads to populism, which leads to protectionism. So there's absolutely no doubt that the world is going that way. And there will be some reshoring, I'm sure, as a result of what happened in the pandemic. But I'll give you one interesting fact. I think Ernst & Young did a survey of CEOs in April 2020 about their plans for reshoring or inshoring or nearshoring. And 83% of them, or is it 80 or 83, said at the time, yes, that they were actively thinking of how to bring supply chains near, make them more domestic, bring them nearer home. They've repeated the survey in April of 2021, and that number is down to the 20s. So, and that shows you that, yes, maybe at the height of the pandemic, there was more thought of that. But that, look, as this is settling down, supply chains are becoming more, are being very resilient, and people are rethinking all this kind of protectionist type of policies and making things domestic and realizing that might not be the answer. So the protectionist tendencies, we are hoping that as time moves on, countries will take a look, and it might not go as far as some people think it will, because simply it's in the interest of everyone to have a functioning multilateral trading system. At the end of the day, 75% of world trade is still going on under WTO rules. And that is very comforting, given the fact that many people think this will dramatically change given the pandemic. So let's see how it goes.
It's so refreshing to hear that, to hear you say that it is important to have an effective functioning multilateral system. It's something that I hear too little nowadays. But this has given rise to a couple of terrific questions from our subscribers. One, an anonymous one, says, some analysts say there is deglobalization, possibly so that there would be three key trade regions, North America, Europe, and Asia, which will turn inward. The question then is, what does that mean for Africa? What is your view for a region like Africa if the world does split into trading blocs? Where does Africa sit in that?
Well, first of all, that's a terrific question. But from where I sit at the WTO, it just looks so difficult for the world to split into trading blocs, given the facts on the ground are too many. There's just no way, with the kind of supply chains we have and the feeling of CEOs that, look, it doesn't really pay to do all of that. But that being said, people say, there's a deglobalization. I think what we are looking at or we need is a re-globalization. Africa has not really been as well integrated into the world trading system as it should be. The share of trade is 2 to 3% of world trade, and that has stagnated for some time. So the key issue is, how do we get a reintegration if you include those areas left behind? The African continent, many low-income countries, even emerging markets. You will give another whiff to the globalization story, which might even have inclusion included in it if you leave it to people like me, making up for what was not done in the past. So I don't so much think of deglobalization. I look towards a re-globalization. I know the heydays of globalization are gone. In the 1990s to mid-2000s, we had an enormous impact of globalization as we integrated China, the East European countries, India and others into the system. All that is now done, but we can reintegrate those who were left behind. And that is the way that I think we should go. And all those countries are members here, all the African countries. And guess what? They have also agreed to do something which is enormously helpful to the continent. This is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the one with the largest number of countries. This will open up borders within the continent, and that we have to work really hard to make sure those borders truly open. And with that, you have a market of 1.3 billion. So within Africa trade, and hopefully with some specialization among countries, we'll also be able to have outside Africa trade, which will be integrating the whole continent better.
So we'll come on in a second to what you mean by reglobalization, what a 21st century globalization looks like, because I agree with you that it will be different to the one we had at the beginning of this century. But first, another sort of epochal question from Darren this time. Will rising nationalism and criticism of globalism end the movement towards increased free trade, peace, and the balance between democracy and authoritarianism?
I think it will disturb it, but it will not end it. I don't think we will see a linear line to things just working well with free trade. No, we've had the shakeups that we've seen, the hiccups, the tendencies towards nationalistic behavior. So we will see some of that. And that is because the politics of inequality is a very difficult one, and it makes policymakers and politicians react sometimes in a way that is counter free trade. But I think that when all is said and done, the world is so intricately woven together now. The supply chains are too complex to undo. And the gains to be made from specialization in the world are enormous. So I think it will not do away with free trade, but we will have hiccups along the way.
So let's talk about how we create that better kind of globalization, how we deal with the disturbances. And I think one of the big sort of arguments made against globalization is that it has been unfair, that it has failed workers, that somehow it has helped capital, it has not helped workers. This is something you hear in many, many countries, particularly, the more advanced economies. Is that fair? Is it true that globalization has failed workers, or is it actually just that the proponents of globalization didn't make the case clearly and well enough? Is it a PR job, or is it a substantive shortcoming?
No, I think it's a substantive shortcoming in several senses. But don't forget the role of technology, Zanny. People talk about trade, but many of these changes come from new technology. And I think that where the failure comes is what I referred to earlier. When, as a result of technology, you have some industries that are no longer labor intensive, but are now capital intensive. Economic theory, in theory, people should move away to where there are new jobs being created. But it doesn't happen like that. There are market failures. People stay where they are for cultural reasons. Without retraining and without attracting new industries, then you have people who are left behind. And often, what new technology does is often blamed on trade. But nevertheless, I think there's a bit of both in substance. It's a substantive issue. If we don't learn how to deal with the inequalities we see now within countries, in the rich countries, as well as between countries, I think we will continue to have that bashing of globalization. And I think policymakers really need to rise up with the kind of policies that will change things. And that is this change in globalization that you and I are talking about now. What should it look like?
So the new Biden administration U.S. trade representative, Catherine Tai, she talks about a worker-centered trade policy. She actually says that the WTO doesn't adequately hear from workers. Do you agree that we need a worker-centered trade policy? And what would that really entail?
I think we need a trade policy that is about people. I will tell you one thing. I'll go back to what I said in the beginning. The Marrakesh preamble to this WTO agreement set out three purposes: enhance living standards, create jobs, and support sustainable development. When you look at all of this, what does it say? It's about people and our planet. And it's so relevant today. I think what has happened over time is the WTO has been turned into a negotiating forum for trade lawyers. I don't have anything against trade lawyers, but I think over time, it's been forgotten that the negotiations here are supposed to be about people. If you're here to deliver for people, you will not take 20 years to negotiate an agreement about fisheries and livelihoods. If you're about the planet, you will not take 20 years to know that your fish stocks are going down or to negotiate an agriculture. So I think people were left out of the equation. And actually, I was accused of being a development person as not being suitable to run the WTO, which made me laugh because it's the complete opposite. You've turned the WTO into a zero-sum game negotiating forum because people have forgotten what it's all about. That's what we're trying to change. We're trying to bring it back to be about people. And there, I have absolutely no problems with what Catherine Tyler, the Biden administration, is saying, because who are workers? Workers are people. We ought to be thinking of the impact on people when we're doing every single thing we're doing. That's my mantra. That's why I took this job.
That is music to my ears, and as someone who long ago in my career used to cover trade policy, I completely attest to the fact that there are a huge number of trade lawyers running trade policy, and I'm glad you have nothing against them, since that's probably most of the people that you deal with. But it does seem often rather divorced. It seems divorced from the real world, and too often it's about the subclause 65.8 of some agreement, and it seems dry and technical and not really about people's livelihoods. So if you can change that, I think you are on an important step to getting people excited about trade again.
Yeah.
But let's focus on the climate, which you raised, because I think that's a really important and interesting area. The EU and other countries are exploring using border adjustment tariffs against high polluting countries. Do you think that's a good idea? Do you think the WTO can and should play a big role in the climate agenda going forward?
Let me start with that. Yes, I think that trade and climate is absolutely essential for the WTO to play a role, because I believe that net zero by 2050 is important for our planet, and we need to do everything we can reasonably to reduce carbon emissions. Now, in doing this, we have to recognize that not every country is in the same place. So we need to have just transitions for poor countries, for developing countries. They cannot go at the same pace. And a lot of the carbon emissions, very little comes from this. Africa is 3% of global carbon emissions. So when you're talking of contributing, you need to have that. But all that being said, I think we need to look at trade and see the areas where trade can contribute. Let me say this, the most important thing that would have been good is to have a global carbon price. But that is not happening. What we have now is 64 different prices from 64 jurisdictions, ranging from less than $1 a ton in Ukraine to about $130 a ton in Sweden. And now the European Union wants to do the CBAM, the carbon adjustment mechanism. Well, they have said very clearly, in fact, today I was on a panel with Commissioner Dombrovskis, and he said very clearly that they will do it in a WTO compatible way, which is very good, because a number of our members are really afraid that this might become another NTB, another non-tariff barrier, or measure of protectionism. So how they design it and how it's implemented is critical. We haven't seen the design yet, so I can't tell you whether or not it works or doesn't work, and whether or not it would be acceptable to members. I think they also need a dialogue with our members, so it's not seen as something just being alien to them. So there's quite a lot of work to be done, and I think the EU is has said it will put time into making sure that this is designed in a way that is compatible. We have to look at the legal aspects, the technical aspects, the implementation aspects, which are quite tough and complicated, I think.
Beyond, they are, and the WTO will have an important role if this is not to become a sort of an additional form of protectionism. But more broadly, and this leads to a question from Philip, one of our subscribers, who asked a very broad but important question. What role can the WTO play in the transition to a sustainable world economy, where we need less stuff and less movement of goods instead of more stuff?
Well, let's look at it this way. There's one thing that we can do. How do we lower tariffs, favorable tariffs for environmentally friendly goods and services? And some negotiation had started on that front at the WTO, but it was shelved in 2016. One of the things we're trying to do is bring that back and look at a list of goods. There are now so many goods because times have changed. If we could have an agreement that incentivized the use of those goods that are environmentally friendly, that would be a big contribution. So that's one thing we can certainly do. I've already talked about our contribution to the sustainability of the oceans through the negotiations about harmful fisheries subsidies. Coming back to carbon emissions, We're also looking at things, there's a dialogue going now about plastics, and how do we deal with this issue of plastics? Fossil fuel subsidies, there's also a dialogue going on about that, and how we can look at those issues from the trade lens. Goods that lead to high carbon emissions, deforestation, and planting of good things like palm in a way that is not environmentally friendly. We've proven that you can do it in a good way. Unilever in Indonesia has changed the way it approaches business and has shown how to do it. So encouraging those things, not trading in goods that lead to high carbon emissions, or putting it the other way, incentivizing trade in goods that lead to low carbon emissions. I think those are areas where trade can contribute. Then the logistics of trade itself, whether you're looking at moving goods through shipping, through airplanes, through trains, whatever means, looking at how that can also be managed and brought down. Those are areas. So I see a lot of potential for good work on the trade side.
Absolutely. And this leads to a really interesting question from Parita, who asks, how will carbon taxes affect the nature of supply chains or free trade? Do you think the impact would be very big?
Well, when you talk to business, I think business is now very much on the net zero train. I was at an international business meeting in Paris yesterday. There were about 100 top CEOs in the room. And when a question was asked about how many of them are heading for net zero by 2045, not even 2050, about half the hands in the room shut up. So it looks like business has really got the message about net zero. And I think that approach, having business in it is very, very helpful because it means we stand a chance of getting there. Countries have also pledged net zero by 2050. The EU has moved to 55% by 2030. So I think all along the way, this is the impact is recognized, and carbon taxes for business. I think business accepts and sees it coming. What is worrying them is, will there be a level playing field? Will it be the case that there'll be a carbon tax in one jurisdiction that is not practiced in another, and therefore you have carbon leakage, and carbon outsourcing? So you have production in jurisdictions that don't have the same kind of carbon tax taking place. So you don't really solve the problem, where the people in places where their carbon taxes find that the cost of their products have gone up. So it's the level playing field aspect of carbon taxes that is worrying to business. And this is why I say that if we could find a global carbon price, this would really help us solve the problem.
And that's where the WTO comes in to create that level playing field, if you will. We're running out of time, I realize. One more subject that I briefly wanted to touch on, because the third element of 21st century globalization, if you will, is that the nature of trade has changed so radically. It's instead of goods now, it's increasingly that we're trading services, digital services in particular. These are areas where, and I'm going to exaggerate slightly, but basically there are hardly any WTO rules. It's not really in your purview. How important is it that you start to have rules in those areas to A, prevent you becoming less relevant, but B, to shape the global economy going forward?
I think, Zanny, it's absolutely crucial. And that, we have, the world is digital now, and more trade is e-commerce. As you said, we have trade in goods is growing at a decreasing pace, whereas trade in services is rising. Pre-pandemic, at least services have been hit during the pandemic, but I expect them to come back up. So it's very vital that we look at the area of services, we look at the area of digital, and we have proper rules that underpin that. The good news coming is that we have an e-commerce negotiations going on with about 83 members involved, and they hope to bring in many more, that looks at the rules that should underpin digital trade and underpin e-commerce. There are very tricky issues like cross-border data flows, digital taxes, how you govern those. You have developing countries and emerging markets who don't have a strong regulatory regime, so they're a bit reluctant to go into agreements where they are not sure whether this will come back to haunt them. So we have those sorts of issues. But that being said, they are really moving on at a very reasonable pace. And I hope that by the time we have our ministerial at the end of the year, they would have made considerable progress. With respect to services, we have domestic services regulation negotiations going on. Again, it's a plurilateral among a subset of our members. I think 50-something of them are involved in this. And if we get that done, that could also underpin the rules for services and would really go a long way towards leveling out that playing field that we're talking about. So there's movement. We would like it to be faster. I think business wants it to be faster. We need it, but we're not completely out of we're not completely out of the subject. We're trying to get it done.
So listening to you go through that area of topics, or indeed over the last hour, no one could accuse you of lacking ambition. I mean, from climate to the post-pandemic to the digital, you have a huge to-do list. And yeah, I guess I have to then ask you, are you trying to do too much? And what is the most important? What are, let's say, the top 2 priorities that you are really determined to get done in your term?
Within that list, Zanny, and now you understand why I like the job and went for it, because it's so exciting. There's so much potential. But in that list, I have what I call deliverables for this year. And we're looking top priorities, trade and health. Can we get a ministerial declaration that says what WTO members should do in a pandemic now and for the future, so we don't have to negotiate over it again? 2, after trade and health is the fishery subsidies. Those are my top 2 priorities. Then comes dispute settlement. We have to get that system reformed because there's no point making new rules if the place where the rules can be brought, if they're broken, doesn't work. So I do have 3 top ones, and then comes agriculture. So the deliverables are narrow. This year they are not. They're very difficult. I will not deny that. Getting to agreement in any of these areas is a tall order, but we are pushing. And maybe we can get trade and health because it's of the moment. Everybody knows the WTO has to show relevance in this area. Fishery subsidies, the SDG and sustainability agreement is very strong. So even if we end up with agreements on those 2, and then a work program on some of the other issues, like the dispute settlement, not to solve it, but to agree on where we are going, that's good enough. If we make some advances in women and trade, another area I didn't even mention, this would be also very good. So
well, that would be a huge amount for 1 year. But I have a suspicion that if anybody can get any of it done, it is you. I'm not going to end this without one completely unrelated question, which is that I know, given the ambition of what you want to do, I imagine that you don't have a lot of spare time, but I do know that you are a prolific reader. So what are you reading right now? Any recommendations for me and indeed for our subscribers?
Let me tell you what I'm reading. I don't have much time now to read anything, but I'll share with you. I'm reading my son's book of poetry. So my second son is about to publish a book of poems, and I'm going through them. And some of them are very inspirational for me. I hope the book will come out in the next few weeks. So that's what I'm going through. His poems, and they give me hope, they inspire me. Some of them are about love, some are about life, some are about discrimination, some are about the future. From a young man, this is what I look at when I want to see hope.
How wonderful. What a wonderful way to end. I wish your son all the best with the publication of his poems. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for watching. I'm Sasha Nauta, Deputy Executive Editor at The Economist. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming events, please click the link. There you'll also find details about previous webinars, such as on whether Brazil can survive Bolsonaro and on race in America. See you soon.